Welcome back to Let's Talk Decarbonisation with me, Matt Stadlen, and I'm delighted to say that our guest today is Philip Sellwood. He's the chair of Zemo, Zero Emissions Mobility Organisation, and he also sits on the board of Renewable Energy Association. He's got many other roles as well, and until fairly recently, he was also the CEO of the Energy Saving Trust. A very warm welcome to you, Philip.
Hi, Matthew.
I just want to start, if I may, really big picture. Given your expertise in the area, where do you feel we are in the climate emergency?
Well, the analogy I like to sometimes use is that if we were setting out to climb a mountain, say Everest, because that's the scale of the challenge, we're beyond base camp, but we're certainly no further than Camp 2. So we're in the foothills of this agenda at the moment.
This interview is linked to Net Zero Week. How far do we have to go in the UK?
We have to go enormously far in some areas, such as transport and the decarbonisation of heat, for instance. In other areas like generation, we've made great progress on power generation over the last 15 years or so, but we're still in a situation with transport, for instance, where actual transport emissions are still growing compared to 1990, and we've got to see somewhere around a 40% reduction, but before 2030.
How behaviour change will unlock net zero was a report around this time last year, April 2021. It was a report by the Energy Research Partnership. What were the key findings?
Well, I think the key findings were at the very highest level that we will not reach a net zero future without significant behavioural change. There are many people who think that all we have to do is roll out certain technologies, decentralised heat pumps, solar panels, offshore wind, EV transport, and that's the job done. But the reality is, unless we're to see significant behaviour change, not just by households and citizens, but also by businesses and organisations in the public, private and third sector, we will not make that significant change. And I think the other key finding is that if we don't see that significant behaviour change, it will be very difficult to achieve social consent for the net zero transition.
If I say the words Green Deal to you or Green Homes Grant, what's your reaction?
My reaction is, actually, it was a very good idea conceptually, but rather poorly administered, and it was too complex for ordinary people to really get their head round. And the two key things for me that we need to ensure, if any policies coming forward like the Green Deal, they've got to be consistent and they've got to be concise, because if they're not those two things, people won't have faith in them, they won't think they're going to last very long, and they won't actually understand the details either. So lots of people said, oh, what a terrible idea, but actually the idea behind Green Deal and many other government policies have been quite solid, but the execution has actually been quite poor.
And those criticisms also stand, do they, for the Green Homes Grant?
Yes, I think at the end of the day, this was a scheme that really ought to have worked quite well, but it was rushed into service, if I can put it that way. It didn't last long enough, so there was a deadline set that had to be all wrapped up by the end of the financial year, and of course that leads to people rushing to take advantage of these schemes, and then you find that the supply chain is overwhelmed, and people again lose faith. And if you've got businesses that won't invest in the initiative, and if you've got citizens who won't feel confident that they can actually benefit from it, then not surprisingly, it hasn't worked.
You've already mentioned or alluded to public sector, the private sector. How important are partnerships in fighting climate change?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say, whether it's a partnership of organisations in business, whether it's public, private sector, whether it's nation states, um, this crisis knows no boundaries. It doesn't know any local authority boundaries or regional boundaries or indeed national boundaries. So forging relationships between the private sector and the public sector at every level is absolutely crucial in order to pull this off.
How good are we at that in the United Kingdom?
Well, I think we're pretty good at what I would call sector coordination. So the Zemo organisation that you said that I was a chair of, that's a classic example of bringing together big corporates and small, medium-sized enterprises with government departments, government officials, and academics all together to solve some fairly difficult problems. And I think it's a really good example. It's only one example, but it's a good example of introducing, for instance, alternative fuels into the marketplace, the drive towards electric vehicle transition. These are all being done through partnership working because, let's be clear, in the move to net zero, there will be losers as well as winners. And therefore, it's absolutely essential that people understand that and accept that and work together in order to meet that common objective.
The government has set out its ambitions for net zero by 2050. How close are we to net zero in the mobility area, in the transport area, which is one of your focuses?
Yeah, no, I mean we're a long way off, Matthew. To be truthful, whether that's in the passenger car market or in the freight market, we're making good progress in some areas. So interestingly enough, we're making good progress in areas like buses, where you've probably seen up and down the country the introduction of either electric or hydrogen fueled buses, and that's been, signally a serious achievement in terms of urban mobility. But you'll also have seen that hasn't really had any delivery yet in a rural setting. So you've got areas like buses that have worked quite well, but you've got some really difficult areas like heavy goods vehicles, which aren't suitable really for battery technology unless they're delivering within cities. So whether it's through gas, whether it's through hydrogen, finding solutions for freight is really difficult. And it's not just, as I said at the outset, just about technology. It's about people changing their behaviours. It's an unfortunate fact that we will need to make sure that we're investing more heavily in mass transit systems to get people back onto public transport. We've seen after the pandemic, for instance, just a real move away from public transport, which means that emissions from passenger car vehicles, for the first time in a number of years, are actually going up, not going down.
Electric cars have had a bit of a bad press very recently. What can we do to make them cheaper, to make them more efficient in terms of reliability? So if someone needs to drive, I say need, but if someone chooses to drive hundreds of miles, how can we help persuade them that they are going to be okay on their journey?
Yeah. Well, first thing to say is that the issue predominantly no longer lies with the vehicle itself. Every time you open, a newspaper, or every time you look at social media, you see one of the large automotive companies launching yet more models available for all sorts of uses, for families, for individual people wanting to travel, city to city. So there are a significant range of vehicles now available to the general public. The big issue that we're facing, and it's certainly an issue that the Electric Vehicle Energy Task Force is struggling with at the moment, is to ensure that the infrastructure is rolled out much more quickly, so that if having to go from London to Manchester, you shouldn't be feeling any range anxiety because you think, well, I'm not going to be able to top up en route because at the moment the reality is that the infrastructure is neither significant in numbers, and too often people are turning up and finding the infrastructure is either not working or it's using a different app. So all of those things need resolution. So we need a consistent rollout UK wide of many thousands of, it's estimated, depending on who you listen to, but anywhere between 500,000 and 700,000 charge points, both domestic and also, as you say, on mass transit routes. Because what we're not saying, we shouldn't be saying that people shouldn't be travelling. We're social animals. We need to move about. We've got businesses to run. We've got relatives to meet. All of those things. So it's about making that infrastructure more consistent, readily available, and most of all reliable.
So we need to get very quickly, much more quickly than we are at the moment, perhaps, to a point where charge points for electric vehicles are as easy to access, if not easier to access, than petrol stations.
Yeah, I mean, and the analogy is right. The difference, of course, is that we've got an opportunity with electric vehicles to charge at home, which obviously you can't do in terms of fossil fuels. But there will be many situations for people in domestic properties, flats, streets, where it's not available, charging's not available. So it absolutely has to be as readily available as possible. And I don't know if you've even seen today's press, certainly in the Times and other papers today, centre spread about GridServe's latest fast charging hub, which is opened in Norwich. I think it's their second or third super hub, as they're calling it. And it's these things, these areas and these locations that really will change people's attitude, because they'll, as you say, they'll just start to see it as everybody's convenient as dropping into your local petrol station and topping up.
And just to be clear, how advanced are we at the moment on motorways? So if I chose to drive to Scotland instead of taking the train, which would clearly be the better option, but if I chose to drive to Scotland for whatever reason, and would I be equally well served as things stand by electric car charge points as I am by petrol stations?
I think my answer to that would be, the one difference would be you would probably have to plan your journey slightly differently, but there's no reason why you can't drive from one end of the country to another using an electric vehicle. But it's true to say that you have to make sure that, depending on the vehicle you're driving and the infrastructure, that actually, going back to my earlier point, that they are reliable and available and ready to use.
But
There's
are they available at the moment? Are they
they are
as readily available, these charge points on motorways, as petrol stations? I don't know the answer to this because I have a petrol car.
no. The answer is they are readily available. One of the issues that we're facing is their reliability, and that's where people like GridServe, as I say, who have opened this hub today or this week, they're now actually in charge of the motorway infrastructure for the UK, or certainly for England and Wales, and they're investing, I think the last number I saw is £1 billion in ensuring that motorway network is every bit as efficient and available as petrol stations currently are. But there's no reason why the combination of a bit of judicious planning and thinking ahead means that you can't actually use an electric vehicle. But it's true to say that we just still have not done anywhere near enough in terms of rolling out the infrastructure.
What do you mean by reliability then in this context?
Well, that's two things. One is we have a situation at the moment in the UK where you should be able to approach any electric vehicle charging point and be able to pay for it using a single go cardless type application. The reality is that many of them are proprietary applications, which means that they aren't available to everyone, which is confusing, and I think we've got to overcome that problem. And secondly, there's the issue that some of the infrastructure is already aging very quickly as a result of being put in, a number of years ago on motorways, for instance, and too often they are not actually operating as effectively as they should be, and some are not operating at all. And I think we're seeing lots of feedback about that. But having said that, this is a situation that is improving literally all of the time. My contention is that we just need to move further and faster on this agenda.
And what about the greenness of electric cars? How green are they actually?
Well, are you talking about the car itself, or how it's fueled?
How it's doing? So obviously, to build an electric car, just as if you were to build a petrol car, you're going to consume energy in that process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Once you get to the point of use, how green is the energy that they use?
In terms of how the energy is fueled into the car, it's obviously fundamentally important that that is driven by renewables, because if all you're doing is generating electricity through fossil fuels, then you're not really solving the problem. You're only solving half the problem. In terms of the production of the car itself, there's been a number, I mean, dozens of studies basically showing that on an end-to-end, a full life cycle basis, from creation through to use to recycling at the end of use, that an electric vehicle always is greener than a fossil fuel alternative. I don't think I've seen too many studies suggest otherwise. But like all of these things, it's important that we keep in mind that, for instance, with the development of battery technology, that we need to think of much more sustainable ways of using batteries after, for instance, they have used their effective life in an electric vehicle. And there are all sorts of things, models emerging where that can happen. So at a high level, they will always be greener. But can we make them even greener? Yes, of course we can.
Isn't the future train travel?
Train travel there's no question that if you were wanting to drive from London to Glasgow or take the train, from an environmental perspective, unfortunately not from an economic perspective currently, because of the price of public transport, from an environmental perspective, there's no question that taking the train is absolutely the right alternative. However, and it is a big however, we still need to see the mass electrification of certain train journeys. We've got still far too many train journeys that are really undertaken, particularly cross-country train journeys, that frankly are being taken by, fueled by very, very poor environmental diesel. And until we see the electrification of those trains, then I think whilst it's a better alternative than the car, it's still not environmentally terribly clean.
Tell us just a little bit more of other areas of interest and impact that you work on as chair of Zero Emissions Mobility Organisation of Zemo.
One of the areas that I touched on earlier that we're working, so we're not just working with passenger cars, we're working with heavy goods vehicles, we're working with buses. One area that we're recently getting involved in, because we're seeing it as a significant possibility, is the development of, if you like, low level, low impact mobility. So we're talking scooters, mopeds, single cargo delivery vehicles. All of these areas have been pretty much neglected, and they actually represent some very interesting opportunities, particularly for short journeys. You've probably heard the much quoted statistic that somewhere around 95% of cars are sitting on people's drives, and they're only ever 5% in use. And also that 35% is the number of journeys are taken. They're less than 3 miles. So if you can find ways to encourage people to, obviously, ideally walk or cycle, but if they're not able, perhaps to use electrically assisted mobility through mopeds, electric scooters, small delivery cargo vehicles, then there's an opportunity to take away a very, very significant number of journeys that are currently being made by car or by van.
Are mopeds not high emitters?
A traditional moped, yes, but actually the development that we're now starting to see of electrically assisted, I don't mean just electrically assisted bicycles, but electrically assisted what are called L category vehicles. These are the vehicles that we think will actually make a significant difference to reducing those short-term journeys.
What do you make of the boom, Philip, in food delivery services and of course product delivery services? So you think just, for example, of Uber Eats or Amazon or Deliveroo. Uh, is the boom of these services doing more harm than good, or more good than harm?
I think it's very difficult to say. I think anybody who thinks they have the definitive answer, then I'd love to hear from them. We know, because on the one hand, if you've got one vehicle delivering to 20 households, that's significantly environmentally better than 20 people getting in their car and driving to the local supermarket. However, the boon, as you said, in not just food deliveries, but just single-use deliveries for everything from a pair of trousers through to a TV through to that evening's dinner. The scale of that has led to a massive increase, not just in emissions in certain urban environments where perhaps the less progressive companies are not using electric vehicles or alternatively fueled vehicles. There's no doubt that's leading to significant emissions growth and also congestion, which of course is a secondary feature, and that's causing all sorts of issues with air quality in urban environments. So I think, to be honest, it's the jury's out as to whether or not at an aggregate level it's a better or worse environmental solution. What we can say is that it's a service that people want. So we have to find a way of delivering that to people in a way that is both environmentally acceptable in a long-term sense, and also economically acceptable to the user and to the operator. So it's a significant challenge. I think one of the areas where I don't think we've made anywhere near enough progress, for instance, is in the development of alternatively fueled or electric vans compared to, say, passenger vehicles. And of course, most of the deliveries that you're seeing to people's houses are actually in vans.
We haven't mentioned in our discussion of mobility aeroplanes.
Yeah.
Talk us through the future of air travel and whether you think that we can reach a point where it can be done sustainably, guilt-free.
People will always want to travel, whether that's to travel for hospitality reasons, holidays, or whether it's for business. So basically saying you shouldn't travel is really not the answer. We may all need to travel less, but that's not the same as saying that we shouldn't be flying. So I'm not in that camp at all. So I think we'll always be flying. Clearly, there are technical solutions or technology solutions that are being developed. So alternative fuels, what are called sustainable fuels. You may have seen in the press and the media last week a whole thing around the first hydrogen charged flight that took place last week, 288 miles, I think it was. That could be the future for cargo, for instance, deliveries. And certainly to your earlier point, longer term sustainable urban deliveries could be using that, because it's essentially like large drones. But in terms of mass air travel, I think we probably will need to travel less. But I think the challenge is really significant in terms of the technical solutions. But what is interesting is just to remind people that the vast majority of flights are taken by a relatively small number of people. So over 70%, I think the last statistic I saw, over 70% of flights worldwide are taken by 15% of the users. So there are massive users generating massive carbon footprints. Now, at the moment, they're not paying anything like the true cost of the environmental damage that they are causing. So it's not about the average family of four going on holiday to Mallorca. It's much more about the person who's perhaps going back and forth to France to a second home, or flying, more frequently through business connections. But at the moment, they're paying no greater cost than somebody who's perhaps only flying once a year. And we also need to remember that nearly 25% of people don't fly at all. So it's a long answer to a short question, but it is very complicated. There's no question about it. But I think finding simple solutions is not going to be easy.
Briefly, what did you learn from almost 2 decades at the Energy Saving Trust? I mean, you were there, I think, from 2003 to 2020.
Yeah. Well, I think first thing is to say, looking back after 17 years or whatever it was in that job, the progress that we have made has been fantastic. There's no question about that, because sometimes it's very easy to look at where you are and forget from where you've come. So we've made some very, very significant policy and practical steps on the road towards, a zero emissions future. I think two things I would say I've learnt. One is we are consistently very poor at consistent policy making. It's the whole energy transition has been too much of political football for the last 2 decades, and I think we need to accept that the net zero transition, which is now set in law, of course, is not a party political issue. It's an issue for not just the UK but globally. So I think one thing I've learned is that you've got to have policies that are consistent and continuous. So I'd love to see an end to some of the short-term thinking that has marred the development of the zero transmission of technology over the last 2 decades. Second point I'd make is the point that you raised, which is the absolute importance of behaviour change, because unless we take people with us on this journey towards a zero emissions future, it would neither be zero emissions and neither will it be a just transition. So I think behaviour change allied to good, consistent policy making are the two things I think that I take away from that time.
On behaviour change, do you think it's going to have to be enforced by the state, not just in Britain but around the world, or do you think it can still happen organically, given we are seriously running out of time?
I think we will have to up the ante, both in terms of the carrots that we offer people in order to adopt the right sorts of behaviours, on the one hand. So I can see the development of much more sophisticated use of fiscal incentives, whether that's through the tax system or whether that's through the planning system, for instance, to encourage people to invest in the right sort of technologies in their homes and businesses. But equally, Matthew, I think you're absolutely right. I think we are approaching the stage where we will see a greater use of mandatory powers in order to insist that certain technologies, certain behaviours are, frankly, outlawed, and whether that's through phasing out of technologies like fossil fuel vehicles. 2 decades ago, we would have never thought that was possible politically, but clearly that stage is now, that's been passed, and we will no doubt be facing future similar hurdles in the future. So more incentives on the one hand, because that's always a good thing to do, but equally it has to be backed up with some harder edged mandatory policies.
And just time for one takeaway from your experience on the board of the Renewable Energy Association.
Thing that I think everybody in the renewables family has learnt, sometimes not quickly enough, is that there is no one single bullet, there is no one single technology, renewable or otherwise, that will lead us to where we need to be in terms of the zero emissions future. All of the technologies, whether they be hydrogen, whether they be solar, wind, energy efficiency, electric vehicles, they all have a really, really important part. And I'm glad to see that, one of the things that the REA has really been at the forefront of is just persuading people, persuading governments that actually it's not either or, it's all of the above. We need to make progress on all of these technologies in order to deliver on the zero emissions future that we all hope and agree we need.
I've got 3 more concluding questions. One for government, one for business leaders, and one for the rest of us. And we have to be brief because we're running out of time. If you were Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, what would you do if you could click your fingers to change things or to accelerate things? What would be your priorities?
My priorities would be to start with some fairly basic things like energy efficiency, because that's the simplest, no regrets policy. So I would create a policy framework of at least a decade long to encourage both individual householders and businesses to take up what is, frankly, the easiest, as I say, no regret solution for reducing emissions.
What's your message to business leaders watching this? Can they make serious money in the immediate future, do you think, in the renewables area, in fighting climate change rather than contributing to it?
Yeah, I personally think that my message to business leaders would be you actually represent the opportunity for the future, both for your businesses, your staff, your customers. There are some fantastic commercial opportunities out there, some of which are already being realised. And this isn't about a green future. This is about a sustainable net zero future that I think the private sector has an absolutely massive responsibility to take forward.
And so just to conclude, absolutely finally, given we've talked about the importance of behavioural change, what's your message to the rest of us in our everyday lives?
My message would be, however small some of the changes that you can make in your daily lives, whether that's in what you do at home, how you travel and get to work, what you do when you're at work, all of those things, they may seem very small, but actually collectively they can create a momentum that encourages everybody else to contribute. And I think that, along with government policy and business following on behind, that will lead us to where we need to be in terms of a net zero future.
Philip Sellwood, thank you so much for your time.
Okay, thanks very much, Matthew.